As our final look at Mill before we move on to Dickens, we're going to be looking at his pamphlet Utilitarianism, which he wrote relatively late in his career, and in which he attempts to revise utilitarianism to answer the charge of those people who claim that it's simply the pursuit of physical pleasure and base hedonism, but also to make it consistent with other moral standards. And at the same time, as he makes that modification, he brings it very much in line with the implied moral doctrine that we'll see exemplified in Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and has become described as Dickens', quote, philosophy of Christmas, unquote. In his pamphlet Utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill seeks to clarify, explain, and defend the concept of utility, and also at the same time describes modifications of the concept of utility and the doctrine of utilitarianism in ways that Jeremy Bentham would not have anticipated or supported. The section we will be looking at comes from Chapter 2 and is posted in PDF format on Canvas. And we are going to go to the bottom of the first column on the first page, where Mill provides us with a general broad definition of what the doctrine of utility is. The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Now, the problem that Mill will describe is that pleasure, and to be fair, in Bentham's terms, this is accurate, really refers to a physical sensation, to sensual pleasure. But Mill wants to extend that beyond mere sensual pleasure to the higher forms of pleasure, which we will do later in this doctrine. But he goes on to say, the theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded, namely that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, are desirable either for pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. Now, this is a fairly innocuous statement and recognizes what is a perfectly rational consequence. What he's saying is that things are either pleasurable in themselves or that they're a means to achieve some other pleasure later. So, for example, eating a hot fudge sundae is in and of itself pleasurable, and exercise may not be pleasurable, but it will produce the greater pleasure of good health later. So even if exercise itself is painful and causes suffering, the good that comes later from exercise now means that exercise is a good thing because it is a means to some greater pleasure later. Things in themselves may be painful, but be a means to a greater pleasure. Later, Mill will introduce the idea that what we're pursuing is not individual pleasure, but the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And so, if something is a utilitarian good, if it is a means to a pleasure, and that pleasure is a pleasure that will be enjoyed by another person, one's pain can actually become a utilitarian good. Now, in the next paragraph, he then responds to those people who attack utilitarianism, saying that it is the philosophy of pigs, and that utilitarians in pursuing pleasure are no better than animals who are simply trying to make themselves feel good. Now, such a theory of life excites in many minds, and among them in some the most estimable in feeling and purpose, inveterate dislike. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, a doctrine worthy only of swine. And one of the things about Mill is his responses are always very thoughtful and take on opposing arguments on a variety of different levels. And so he says in the next paragraph, in response to the claim that the followers of utility are proposing as the ultimate standard of moral conduct a standard that is worthy only of pigs, he says, the accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. If this supposition were true, the charge could not be gainsaid, but would then be no longer an imputation. For if the sources of pleasure were precisely the same to human beings and to swine, the rule of life which is good enough for one would be good enough for the other. So in other words, The people who accuse utilitarians of proposing a moral standard that is worthy only of swine seem to assume that humans are capable only of the pleasures that swine are capable of, and if this were true, then it wouldn't be a problem because humans would be capable of no higher pleasures, and so any standard that is good enough for pigs would be good enough for humans. But he claims that that's not in fact true. He says that it's not true precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conception of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. So in other words, humans have a higher standard of happiness than pigs, and humans will pursue happiness that includes other sorts of gratification than simply sensual pleasure. And this introduces into Mill's doctrine of utility a complication. He proposes there is not only a quantity of pleasure, but also quality of pleasure, and that pleasures of higher quality are superior to those of lower quality, and also that higher quality pleasures are those which employ the higher faculties. In other words, the ones that employ the intellect as opposed to sensual pleasure. So the pleasures of reading philosophy or attending a symphony are higher pleasures than the pleasures of lying in the sun on the beach or eating a hot fudge sundae. He says, "It is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone." And so the question then becomes, how do you determine which pleasure is of a higher quality? How do you determine that attending a Mozart symphony is a higher quality pleasure than eating a hot fudge sundae? And he says, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. So if you conducted a survey and you asked people, would you rather attend a Mozart symphony or would you rather eat a hot fudge sundae? And most people said, we'd rather attend a Mozart symphony, then that pleasure has a higher level of quality. He goes on to say, if one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality, so far outweighing the quantity as to render it in comparison of small account. So let's imagine that you have unlimited access to hot fudge sundaes, but you are also interested in health and fitness, and you know that consuming a large amount of sugar is not good for you. So rather than eating a lot of hot fudge sundaes, you forswear the hot fudge sundaes and you go to the gym and work out. You have determined that health is a higher quality pleasure than hot fudge sundaes. So which kind of pleasures tend to fall into the higher quality pleasure category? He goes on to say, now it is an unquestioned fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs the higher faculties. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for the promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. In other words, Mill will argue that of all the pleasures, those which satisfy the higher, by which he means the intellectual capacities or faculties, are those which have a higher quality. And further, that anyone who is familiar with the higher quality pleasures would not resign those higher quality pleasures for lower quality pleasures, even if they knew they could be ultimately happier in the sense that they have a higher quantity of pleasure. So one would much rather be a slightly dissatisfied genius than a fully satisfied idiot. He goes on to say at the bottom of the page, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they know only their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. So he claims that those who do not know the higher pleasures may believe that they prefer the lower pleasures, but it's only because they're unfamiliar with the higher pleasures. This ranking of quality of pleasure introduces a logical problem for Mill. According to the initial concept of utilitarianism, pleasures are based upon empirical observations of what people prefer. One should be able to statistically study pleasures to figure out which things are pleasurable and which things are painful, and which pleasures are preferred over other pleasures by a majority of people. However, there's a problem that a significant number of people demonstrably prefer what Mill would class as lower quality pleasures. So Mill is forced to establish a normative, subjective criterion for determining which are lower and higher quality pleasures, which, although it justifies Mill's distinction in quality of pleasure, also make his judgment depend upon subjective qualities as opposed to empirical observation. For Mill, the problem comes up in the next section when he seeks to explain why some people choose lower quality pleasures over higher quality pleasures. How do you deal with a person who is familiar with both the higher and lower pleasures and opts for the lower pleasures? Now, in Mill's own time, he should be familiar with addiction, and so clearly he was aware that some people sacrifice higher pleasures for lower pleasures because addictions will drag us to do things that harm us and sacrifice higher pleasures. But he actually has a way of dealing with this. It may be objected that many who are capable of the higher pleasures occasionally, under the influence of temptation, postpone them to the lower. But this is quite compatible with a full appreciation of the intrinsic superior of the higher. Men often, from the infirmity of character, make their election for the nearer good that they know it to be the less valuable, and this no less when the choice is between two bodily pleasures than when it is between bodily and mental. They pursue sensual indulgence to the injury of the health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good. How Mill gets out of this problem of people selecting lower pleasures over higher pleasures is that those who select the lower pleasures clearly suffer from infirmity of character. There's something wrong with them. And because there is something wrong with them, they do not become legitimate judges of whether or not a pleasure is higher or lower. They disqualify themselves. So if we go on, he says, from this verdict of the only competent judges, I apprehend there can be no appeal. On a question which is the best worth having of two pleasures, or which of two modes of existence is the most grateful to the feelings, apart from its moral attributes and from its consequences, the judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or if they differ, that of the majority among them must be admitted as final. This section reveals the problem with Mill's notion of quality of pleasure. According to Mill's standard, it should be based on pure empirical observation, which pleasures are preferred by people over other pleasures, and you should be able to simply use statistical studies to see which pleasures are preferred over others. But the problem is that clearly some people seem to prefer lower quality pleasures. So, for Mill, those people who do not prefer higher quality pleasures are therefore not competent judges and suffer from an infirmity of character, at which point Mill's standard of higher versus lower quality pleasures becomes subjective and normative. Those people who do not accept his standard of higher quality pleasures are flawed. Mill's logic at this point in his argument suffers a real problem. Higher pleasures are clearly better than lower pleasures. And if someone prefers a lower pleasure over a higher pleasure, that person has an infirmity of character and is not a competent judge. And how do we know that he is not a competent judge? Because he prefers the lower pleasure over the higher pleasure. So the logic is circular. Once again, we know a higher pleasure is better than a lower pleasure because the competent judges select the higher pleasure over the lower pleasure. And if someone selects the lower pleasure over the higher pleasure, that person is clearly not a competent judge because they have selected a lower pleasure. So it's very much a circular standard. Mill's next question is, how do you deal with the accusation that utilitarianism is basically a selfish creed? that it has to do with self-gratification, that people are constantly supposed to be pursuing their own pleasure at the expense of the pleasure of others. And his argument is actually going to make a significant change in utilitarianism from Bentham's proposal, one that in some ways actually invalidates the basic premise, and that is that people are not pursuing their own individual pleasure, but are pursuing the greatest happiness of the greatest number. In other words, that my goal should not be to maximize my own happiness, but to maximize the total sum of happiness of all people. And then if necessary, I should sacrifice my own happiness to make other people happy. But it is by no means an indispensable condition to the acceptance of the utilitarian standard, for that standard is not the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether. And if it may be possibly doubted whether a noble character is always the happier for its nobleness, there can be no doubt that it makes other people happier, and that the world in general is immensely a gainer by it. Utilitarianism, therefore, could only attain its end by the general cultivation of nobleness of character, even if each individual were only benefited by the nobleness of others, and his own, so far as happiness is concerned, were sheer deduction from the benefit. So Mill's argument actually at its base contradicts the basis of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is based upon the idea that people seek to pursue their self-interest and maximize their pleasure. But Mill's argument is arguing that ultimately utilitarianism can be achieved through people denying their own self-interest and sacrificing their own pleasure for the benefit of others. In the next section, Mill responds specifically to Carlyle's discussion of renunciation or Entsagen, and responds to the argument that people have a higher purpose than simply pursuing happiness. While this is an interesting and complex argument, it's outside of our scope for the moment and outside the context of what we're going to be looking at. After working through his response to Carlyle's argument, he uses Carlyle's concept of blessedness from Sartor Resartus, the everlasting yea, to return to the concept of self-sacrifice as a good in utilitarian standards. On the next page, at the bottom of the column, he says, "Unquestionably, it is possible to do without happiness. It is done involuntarily by 19/20ths of mankind, even in those parts of our present world which are least deep in barbarism. And it often has to be done voluntarily by the hero or the martyr for the sake of something which he prizes more than his individual happiness. But this something, what is it, unless the happiness of others are some of the requisites of happiness?" And so he is recognizing that it's possible to sacrifice one's own self-interest for the purposes of achieving the greatest happiness of the greatest number. In the next column he says, "I fully acknowledge that the readiness to make such a sacrifice is the highest virtue which can be found in man. I will add that in this condition of the world, paradoxical as the assertion may be, the conscious ability to do without happiness gives the best prospect of realizing such happiness as is attainable. The utilitarian morality does recognize in human beings the power of sacrificing their own greatest good for the good of others. It only refuses to admit that the sacrifice is itself a good. A sacrifice which does not increase or tend to increase the sum total of happiness it considers as wasted. The only self-renunciation which it applauds is devotion to the happiness or some of the means of happiness of others, either of mankind collectively or of individuals within the limits imposed by the collective interests of mankind. I must again repeat what the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge, that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. In the Golden Rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. To do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself, constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality. As the means of making the nearest approach to this ideal, utility would enjoin first that laws and social arrangements should place the happiness, or as speaking practically it may be called, the interest of every individual as nearly as possible in harmony with the interest of the whole, and secondly, that education and opinion, which have so vast a power over human character, should so use that power as to establish in the mind of every individual an indissoluble association between his own happiness and the good of the whole. especially between his own happiness and the practice of such modes of conduct, negative and positive, as regard for the universal happiness prescribes, so that not only he may be unable to conceive of the possibility of happiness to himself consistently with conduct opposed to the general good, but also that a general impulse to promote the general good may be in every individual one of the habitual modes of action, and the sentiments connected therewith may fill a large and prominent place in every human being's sentient existence. By acknowledging that the ethics of utility match the golden rule of Jesus of Nazareth, Mill is clearly attempting to connect to the majority of his readers. He's attempting to claim to his readers that they were utilitarians all along without realizing it. But at the same time, by acknowledging that people must be taught to pursue the happiness of the whole as opposed to their own individual happiness, Mill contradicts the basis of Benthamite utilitarianism. Because in Benthamite utilitarianism, an individual always necessarily pursues their own self-interest and attempts to maximize their own happiness. And by being taught to sacrifice our own happiness and to identify our self-interest with the interests of the whole, this no longer becomes a natural consequence of human behavior, but now becomes a normative standard of conduct, not entirely unlike the kinds of conduct proposed by transcendentalists like Carlyle. This also points us at Dickens' lesson of proper social behavior in A Christmas Carol. Because what happens to Scrooge in A Christmas Carol is that he learns to identify his happiness and his interest with the happiness and interests of others. There's actually a passage in utilitarianism that seems to speak specifically to Scrooge. When people who are tolerably fortunate in their outward lot do not find in life sufficient enjoyment to make it valuable to them, the cause generally is caring for nobody but themselves. To those who have neither public nor private affections, the excitements of life are much curtailed, and in any case dwindle in value as the time approaches when all selfish interest must be terminated by death. While those who leave after them objects of personal affection, especially those who have also cultivated a fellow feeling with the collective interests of mankind, retain as lively an interest in life on the eve of death as in the vigor of youth and health. And this is very specifically the lesson that Dickens has Scrooge learn in A Christmas Carol.